In his treatise on architecture, Alberti asserted the role of public festivals of Greek and Roman antiquity to, quote, revive and keep up the vigour and fire of the mind, and to improve the strength and intrepidity of the heart. This he justified morally by reference to a biblical precedent. And I quote again from Alberti. Moses was commended for ordaining that his people should, upon certain solemn days, meet together in one temple and celebrate public festivals at stated seasons. What may we suppose his view to have been of such an institution? Asks Alberti. Doubtless he hoped that the people, by thus meeting frequently together at public feasts, might grow more humane and be closer linked in friendship with one another. So I imagine our ancestors instituted public shows in the city, not so much for the sake of diversions themselves as for their usefulness. End of quote. Educated Venetians were avid readers of architectural treatises, eagerly studying the beautiful printed editions of Vitruvius, Serlio, and Palladio that rolled off their presses, but they hardly needed books to remind them of the value of public spectacle. Pageantry and ceremonial had been part of Venetian civic life throughout the Middle Ages. Could you put on the projector, please? Or can I do it here? Okay. Right, okay, thanks very much. I hope that's visible. As Edward Muir has pointed out, public festivities in Venice honoured 65 saints' days and 10 movable feasts every year. Into this endlessly repeated religious calendar were inserted the entries of foreign dignitaries and ambassadors, the coronations and funerals of doges, and celebrations of victories and peace treaties. In other words, at least once every 5 days, year in, year out, the city of Venice became the setting for elaborate ritual.
Talk about the future of how we live, and I will do it through the medium of architecture. Architecture is an unbelievably slow art. The least architecture ever takes 10 years. So it is very bad art to capture the zeitgeist. We are simply too slow for the zeitgeist, and particularly in this century, our slowness has been kind of really a huge disadvantage. But in the meantime, all our metaphors and all the terms we use, all our words have been kind of taken over by other domains, and particularly Silicon Valley has been kind of very good to use any one of these in terms of trying to make sense of their overall effort. Basically, because we are so slow, an architect today has to be at the same time a kind of sociologist and kind of maybe an anthropologist, and independent of his kind of work, try to understand how the world works. And basically, I've been able to do that as a teacher in Harvard, where, for instance, we looked at China before China was kind of really exploding, and where we discovered that in China, the condition of the city is changing radically. You see it here. This is the major metropolitan center of Shenzhen, and 400 meters away, there are rice fields. So the solidity of a city kind of doesn't exist in China anymore. Cities are provisional and temporary. We had to kind of understand the effect of the market economy in burdening kind of every single citizen in the world with a number of square meters that they have to kind of support and sustain. Fortunately, there's a lot of inequality in those kind of burdens. And we had to understand also how poverty kind of affects cities. This is a picture of Lagos, supposedly the most dysfunctional kind of entity in the world. But if you look carefully, you see kind of concentrations of color, and then you kind of realize that this is not simply a dump, but a kind of recycling center. And you see in this picture, which is a picture of a market, but it also happens to be the picture of a railroad and a train that runs here maybe twice a day. And that obviously, because of the market is running so unbelievably slowly, that the pace of the train is compatible with selling of the market people to the passengers in the train. So as an architect, you have to be kind of deeply aware that in every dysfunction, there is the potential of new functionalities and new ways of working. 2 years ago, I kind of worked on an interpretation or a look, a hardcore look at how each of the elements of architecture, the door, the window, the ceiling, the floor, had been changing kind of under the onslaught, you could say, of the digital world, and discovered that actually no single element was kind of really the same, that basically we had thermostats that could learn, that could anticipate, and that kind of became interactive, so that basically you are not entirely in control of the kind of temperature of your own house. We learned that floors can be equipped with sensors that kind of record every kind of single movement. And we discovered that there were toilets today that respond to every event and analyze it kind of very, very carefully. So what we then discovered is that there is some degree of enthusiasm for turning the entire city into a kind of similar device-ridden environment. And so that we architects were still thinking that we were dealing with the classical elements of architecture, but that those elements, that classical dimension, is at this point completely transforming in something which we still have to understand, and still particularly have to understand what the consequences of this sensor society are going to be, and also what the consequences on the city are. Anyway.
In my recent book, American Glamour and the Evolution of Modern Architecture, published by Yale in 2010, so quite recently, I set out to identify some of the design features and cultural values that are evident in a cluster of modern American buildings of the 1950s, works of architecture that appear at first glance to be fundamentally different from one another, both in function and in overall style. Built for a variety of purposes during a period of intensive economic growth and capital investment, these buildings were much beloved by consumers and by the public at large. Yet they were widely dismissed, as I'm sure you know, by architecture critics as lowbrow, exhibitionist, and unworthy. In short, out of step with the aesthetic and critical values of modern architecture, as these had been codified by European expatriates such as Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and their former Bauhaus and avant-garde colleagues in the United States. Introduced to the public through mass circulation media, such as Life magazine, and made familiar through glossy photographic images and television appearances, these mid-century modern buildings were seen by many observers as the products of a new economic and cultural order, for better or for worse, depending on which camp you belong to. And as such, they represent an important turning point in American 20th century architecture. My challenge as an architectural historian has been to interpret these buildings within their cultural and economic contexts, and to better understand why and how their critical reception could be, and indeed remains, so polarized. Like all architecture, modern American buildings of the mid-20th century, buildings like Eero Saarinen's TWA building at Kennedy Airport, or Morris Lapidus's Algiers Hotel in Miami Beach, Richard Neutra's Kaufman Desert House on the bottom left, or Frank Lloyd Wright's Temple Beth Shalom in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, were created by architects who sought to discover new formal, practical, and experiential solutions that would not only respond to the demands of their clients, but also to contribute to shaping a distinctive form of modern architecture for their own time.
I'm going to just show you a couple of buildings I saw on a recent trip to Israel that was not even a reporting trip, but sort of turned into one, because this is a building that some of you who are interested in architecture and all of you who are interested in journalism may see a lot of in a few months. It's an addition to the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. Has anybody here been to Tel Aviv? So it's a really wonderful architecture city, more Bauhaus buildings than anywhere else in the world. This was designed by Preston Scott Cohen, who's the chair of architecture at the Graduate School of Design at that university up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I forget the name of it. You know, that big one?
The University of the North.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this building is that it looks like one of those kind of faceted spectacle buildings that we've seen a lot of in the last 10 or 15 years, particularly for cultural institutions. And it looks as if the inside is going to also have all of these kind of wild angles. And in fact, what he has done, when you get inside it, there's this incredible central core that the museum goes way into the several stories below grade, all lit with daylight, and it's kind of like a inside of a tornado, all these different angles and curves, and off of these spin perfectly orthogonal galleries. So it's kind of the best or worst, if you like it. It's a kind of, he's got it both ways. He's got a really interesting sort of spectacle museum that is sitting in the middle of this plaza with this incredible circulation area, but the actual galleries are as calm and easy for the curators to use and install as a classic modernist box. And then I wanted to go see this museum. I don't know if you've seen pictures of it. It's in a suburb south of Tel Aviv called Holon. It's a design museum designed by Ron Arad, who's London-based Israeli-born designer, and it's kind of amazing looking as you approach it, but it turns out that it's all packaging. This is just these Corten steel ribbons wrap a completely ordinary concrete box, two-level museum, but it does make some beautiful spaces on the exterior for a courtyard and a cafe and so forth. And then in Jerusalem, I went to the newly revamped Israel Museum, just a wonderful museum that I was very pleased to see in general. And it has just been reordered and reorganized by a New York designer, James Carpenter, who put these beautiful glass pavilions, very quiet, very serene, in front of the museum. But it's a kind of campus museum, and they renovated the original building by an architect named Alfred Mansfeld. It was built in the 1960s, and it's fantastically interesting architecture with galleries that have clear-story windows around them with beautiful light, poured concrete, and each gallery is sort of held up by a kind of tulip-shaped column in the center. It's quite dramatic. So it was as interesting to see the original architecture restored as the additional architecture and new circulation contributed by Jamie Carpenter. Now, on the campus of this museum in the garden, which was designed by Noguchi, by the way, is this really wacky-looking building called the Shrine of the Book. It was designed by Frederick Kiesler. It's